Hello and welcome to the Research Matters podcast. I am your host, Debdutta Paul, and today's episode is on the Infosys Prize 2020 for Humanities. In this episode, I'll be talking to Professor Prachi Deshpande and Professor Akeel Bilgrami. Professor Akeel Bilgrami is the jury chair of the Humanities panel, Infosys Science Foundation. Akeel Bilgrami is Sidney Morgenbresser Professor of Philosophy in Columbia University, City of New York. His book of selected essays on the moral psychology of politics, entitled Secularism, Identity and Enchantment, was published by Harvard University Press in 2014. He teaches courses and seminars on philosophy of mind and language, as well as moral psychology, metaethics, and political philosophy, and in political science, on politics and rationality, as well as on a range of issues from questions of secularism and identity to the effects of globalization on politics and political thought. Welcome, Professor Bilgrami. It is indeed a pleasure to speak with you.
Glad to be here.
Professor Prachi Deshpande is the recipient of the prize for her extraordinarily nuanced and highly sophisticated treatment of South Asian historiography. Professor Prachi Deshpande is an associate professor at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Kolkata. Professor Deshpande's research focuses on social and cultural history of historiography, language, and regional identities. She has published scholarly works in English and Marathi. Her book, Creative Pasts, Historical Memory and Identity in Western India, 1700 to 1960, was published by the Columbia University Press in 2007. In her book and many other articles, she has examined the evolution of modern history writing in Maharashtra from the Maratha period. Professor Deshpande, congratulations on the honor. Welcome to the episode of the Research Matters podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Let me start off this episode with a question to Professor Deshpande. Your field of research, humanities, is the study of ancient and modern languages, literature, philosophy, history, archaeology, anthropology, human geography, law, politics, religion, and art. In this broad area of humanities, where does your research fit in?
Like you said, the humanities are very broad disciplines that study cultural expressions in a range of different ways. And you can say that they critically examine human culture and human society's reflections about itself. History, broadly defined, is the study of different aspects of human society through time, and it has a speculative, critical, even philosophical aspect of understanding how we came to be where we are, where we might be going, and so it's often included as part of the humanities. My own work, I'm a social and cultural historian. I also find myself sort of straddling the domains of history as a kind of humanities, but also as a social science, because social history is sort of broadly about understanding social organization through time, how social conflict and hierarchy have been organized. And cultural history is about the concepts, categories, and mentalities that societies create through which we understand our world, make meaning, how these change over time. My own research kind of on historiography, how people at different points have thought about their history, about their past, sort of fits in over here. So how do certain aspects of the past, certain figures and events get passed down as history? How do scholars practice the craft, and how do ordinary people remember their own histories? Does this have anything to do with the way particular societies are organized, how the patterns of social conflict take place? How does historical thinking and writing change over time? Now, I've researched these questions empirically with respect to Maharashtra and how people in the region have developed a robust historical memory over the last couple of 100 years about the Maratha Empire and its exploits. But more broadly, conceptually, I think my research tries to think about how such historical memories help us understand ourselves and our present and in the process make claims about what our future ought to be. So that's how I think about my work sort of being broadly in the realm of the humanities.
Right. Thank you for the answer, Professor Deshpande. My next question is to Professor Bilgrami. Could you help our listeners understand the importance of Professor Deshpande's work? What are the implications? How much influence does her work have on the broader field of humanities?
Well, her work has already been very influential, and it's part of a burgeoning shift of interest in historical studies in India to the study of particular regions uh, and what are sometimes called vernacular histories, and uh, and I think she's in the forefront of that field, in particular in the Marathi-speaking region of Western India. So this is a very healthy development in Indian historical studies. It brings out how the academy has begun to keep finally keep track of the linguistic diversity of the country and how social systems are very different in different parts of the country. So, for instance, it's impossible to study caste as a generality. Caste in Punjab is very different from caste in Maharashtra, and so you simply have to do the kinds of things that Professor Deshpande has been doing, and I think it's a very healthy development. These regional histories and look at it in the vernacular languages, and languages are a repository of tradition, and that's one reason why we in the humanities study them. In that sense, history stands sort of on the borderline of both the humanities and the social sciences, and Professor Deshpande is in the forefront of that disciplinary boundaries and its crossing.
Thank you, Professor Bilgrami. Professor Deshpande, I'd like to zoom into your work a little bit more. You have written extensively on Marathi literature, history, scripts, grammar, culture, and the polity. Could you give our listeners an idea about the particular topics that interest you?
I'm currently working on the cultural history of scripts and language. So I research how we think about language histories. How do we understand the history of different languages, which are sort of usually understood as the history of so-and-so literature, the history of Marathi literature, the history of Bengali literature, or we think about them through linguistics, the language families that they are part of. They're either Indo-Aryan, they're either or Dravidian, and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to do is think about language history through users, different people who use language in different ways, and everyday language practices. So I take a cursive script. Some of you might have heard of it. It was called Modi.
Yes.
Which literally means broken. It was a kind of cursive script that was used to write business accounts, for record keeping and correspondence in Marathi over the medieval period from, say, the 15th to the 19th, 20th centuries. So I use it as an entry point to explore how people have thought about and used the Marathi language over several hundred years. And there are hundreds of thousands of Modi records across Maharashtra and different parts of the country. And I'm interested in the world of the scribes and the writers who worked in the Maratha bureaucracy and produced them. So how did language and script pedagogy work for them? Many of these scribes were multilingual, and I use these records to ask what multilinguality meant to people in the early modern period, say in the 18th century, especially in such kind of bureaucratic context. When the British conquered the subcontinent, many of these language practices and ideas about language changed. And I'm interested in how the coming of modernity, say the coming of print, a modern state and bureaucracy, education, a public sphere for debate and discussion, through newspapers and so on, how it changed how we think about language and everyday language practices. And so one of the things is, these seem like very mundane kind of everyday matters that are not really worthy of kind of serious historical exploration. But that's precisely the point, that when we peer closely, we find that it is in such activities and changing attitudes that we can actually sense how regional identities, linguistic and national identities take shape and sharpen. Like what should, the Varnamala be? What should orthography be? What is good writing? Who is a good writer? What is correct language? All of these are actually the kind of building blocks of language identity, language usage. And so my interest in Marathi literature, grammar, and script is to really understand what role all of these have played and continue to play in shaping regional debates over society, politics, and culture. Yeah.
That's very insightful. Just out of my own curiosity, when you say multilingual scholars, do you mean other regional languages like Konkani and other languages, or do you mean foreign languages because of the colonial rule, etc.?
Yeah, so it depends on the specific time and the local context that you would be talking about. So for the 18th century, for the 17th and 18th centuries, for instance, I look at how local records that were kept, about revenue and so on in the Dharwad region of what is today northern Karnataka, are kept in three languages and scripts: Persian, Marathi, and Kannada, right? Further down south in Tanjavur, they are kept in sometimes in Tamil, sometimes in Telugu, but also in Marathi and Persian. When you come to the colonial period, there is a kind of Anglo-vernacular hierarchy where there are English records at the top, and then there is a kind of vernacular that is created for each region, that is standardized for each region, and that transforms these earlier kinds of multilingual, multi-scriptural practices that existed. So that's your question is actually absolutely to the point, that when you have to ask all the time what we mean by multilinguality, because those languages and scripts will always be different depending on the time and the spatial context.
Right. And each of the languages must have taken some time to standardize, and there was the influence of the British Empire on that as well, I guess.
Yes, of course, of course. So when we say British Empire, we also mean not just like a definitive kind of policy, but practices that change in the everyday process of administration at different levels. And the joy is really in bringing out these contradictions, how things are intended to be in a particular way, like you want the official language to be this, but you actually find on the ground that people are using language in very different ways. And so when we ask questions about official language or what the vernacular means, we come up with a lot of different answers and different ways in which people relate to language. I think that's the joy of doing the cultural history of language.
Thank you, Professor Deshpande. Professor Bilgrami, my next question is to you. As the chair of the jury, what particularly interested you or interests you in Professor Deshpande's field of research?
Well, as a philosopher, I was very interested in the claims that she made about how you could find elements of history in non-canonical texts. So not texts which were self-consciously history writing, but in literary forms, for instance, you could find elements of historical verisimilitude, and so it's a matter of, as a philosopher, I'm very fascinated by that, because you know, we need to be able to make explicit what the signs are in a text that is non-standard or not canonical, what the signs say of causality are, or generally of veridicality are, where to look, can we make, I mean, it probably can't be codified, but can we at least have a rough sense of the protocols by which one can distill from, say, an epic or even a lyric, uh, uh, what the signs of historical accuracy might be. These are general methodological concerns which for a philosopher are very fascinating. And Prachi Deshpande, uh, uh, you know, part of her work is looking at non-standard texts of that kind. And in fact, the other way around too. She has demonstrates how documentary texts like family chronicles are throughout laced with literary forms of persuasion. So those are very interesting scramblings of uh, canonical and non-canonical uh, textual uh, emergences of history, which was very fascinating to me. And then, you know, there is a real sense you get from her book, which is really what I've read with more care. The recent work on Modi script, I've only read one long piece on, but for a long time I've been interested in the relation between history and memory. I was one of my dissertation supervisors was Paul Ricoeur, who wrote extensively on that topic, and so I've been interested in that for a very long time, and there are some fascinating moments in her work in which uh, she shows the ways in which the sort of proximate collective memory of the Maratha Empire went on to construct a masculinist image of the national ideal. And I think that's a very fascinating uh, uh, part of her work. And in general, I think there is a scrutiny of social factors, social conflicts, sectarian divisions, and so on. And through that, she constructs a social context within which the practices of history writing emerge in the modern period in the Marathi-speaking region of Western India. And that's of great interest to a philosopher like me.
Right. So, for our listeners, Professor Bilgrami is talking about Professor Deshpande's book, The Creative Pasts,
Mhm.
Historical Memory and Identity in Western India. Am I right, Professor Bilgrami?
That's what I was talking about, yeah.
It is very gratifying to see these questions, which are of very kind of everyday urgency to a lot of people around us, about who certain people were, what was their legacy, and how should we remember them today. But these have sort of very deep philosophical resonances as well. I mean, it's not at one level it is the stuff of newspaper headlines and political conflict and so on, but at the other, sort of underlying it is a very kind of deep engagement that scholars and people alike have with questions about the past and the present. And so I'm very glad that I have been able to convey some of that in my book.
So, I want to zoom out of your work a bit and want to ask you a more general question about. So, we currently find ourselves in the middle of many crises, the climate crisis, we have had the COVID crisis, which is still going on. Do you think humanities can play a role in combating these crises like the ones we are facing today?
Uh, this is something that scholars in the humanities and social sciences get asked a lot. What is the immediate practical use of your research? How can you help combat crises like the one that we are facing today? And there are usually, crises of different sorts. And this discussion, I find, I'm sure you are familiar with this as well, takes place in families when someone is struggling with remembering boring historical dates and long lists of kings and queens, or the intricacies of grammar, trying to write a report on some boring book. And you ask, like, what's the point of wasting time on all of this if my son or daughter is going to become a doctor or an engineer or a scientist later on. Right. And the thing is that the humanities and social sciences, we have to realize and remember, they very important role in the sense that they teach deep critical skills about understanding society and culture that do have a role to play in everyday life, right? So, and by critical skills, I don't simply mean the ability to criticize, say you're right, you're wrong, as it is often misunderstood, but to how to intelligently evaluate something. How do you read an in-depth news article and report and glean its overt and subtle arguments, for instance? How do you learn to critically summarize the main insights of a book, especially one that, say, people are calling to be banned or something? Mm-hmm. How do you articulate your own opinion about it beyond saying, I loved it, or I hated it, or I didn't even read it, but I want it to be banned? When you're bombarded with images, with propaganda, with rumors and information overload about all kinds of things, and how do you learn to sift the important from the unimportant, and make a kind of informed, intelligent view of things, sort out polemic from reasoned argument? How do you understand what evidence is? So the core of humanities pedagogy is not simply to find information about cultural activities in the past and to develop a kind of feel good sense about our great culture or something, but to develop a sense of intelligent critical reflection about the present. So ideally, the humanities would challenge preconceived notions about looking at things and prompt you to think creatively, freshly, critically about the world about you. And this might be not just a question of art or music, but about, questions related to civil engineering, to computer science, and so on. So these are deep skills. And as we are flooded with all kinds of contrary images on media all the time, I'd say that these skills are all the more important today. And I mean, if you look at it, say, from the policies related to the current crisis, okay, the COVID crisis, let's just say, from lockdowns to vaccination to the importance of practices like social distancing or masks wearing. Now, all of these are not just kind of rules to follow, but they have cultural meanings too, right? As in, you can't just formulate them in the abstract and expect that millions of people will just follow them as envisaged. So how best can these be communicated to people in order to ensure that these are not just blindly followed, but they're also understood by them? This is partly, say, you can say it's a question of correct and nuanced language and ways to effectively communicate policies. But there's more, right? Even to develop those policies, historians have insights to offer about past pandemics and their long-term, wider kind of socioeconomic and even political impacts. Areas of social sciences, such as public health or medical anthropology, they have valuable insights into how individuals and whole societies relate to ideas, say, of medicine, practices of medicine, what vaccination has been over time, and how people in different parts of the world have reacted to them, why. Now, all these reactions sort of emerge through deeply held ideas about what the body is, what good health is, whom to turn to when in crisis, whether your family or the state or certain institutions, religious or medical. So having this nuanced understanding is extremely necessary for policymakers, extremely valuable in not just developing efficacious or quick policies, but also humane policies, right? Mm-hmm. these are medical crises or political crises. So I would say that it is very important for policymakers and scientists to work with relevant scholars in the humanities and social sciences to combat, all the challenges that we are facing today, from climate change to COVID to political suppression, all kinds. I can go on and on about this, but I think you get the idea.
Yes, I get an overall idea. Professor Bilgrami, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that it's very important role for the humanities to give any sense of crisis a sort of historical depth. Crises are not de novo. I mean, journalists would like to make out that any given crisis is come out of the blue, and each crisis is a completely brand new thing, but it isn't. It very often crises emerge slowly out of evolving aspects of historical tradition, and so it's an essential role of the humanities, I think, to situate what is presented in the media and newspapers as something that seems to be sui generis, as in fact having its basis in a historical tradition, which gets deformed in ways that are distorted to give rise to the crisis. And humanities must play a role in coming to understand that. But also, I think it's a very important, there is something very important that the humanities can also do, which is that very often one thinks that there is a sense in which a crisis can be dealt with by regulation, by laws or new laws, or the implementation of given laws which are being ignored, which they manifestly are in our current crisis in India. But one of the things to really understand is that the law itself is in the foreground, but the law is only really conceivable, leave alone implementable. It's only really conceivable because of a whole background of unspoken customs and practices and social habits, and including relations of trust and cooperation amongst people. And I think it's the role of the humanities to bring out what this background is, which makes regulation possible and efficacious. Without a good understanding of this background of practices and relations of trust and cooperation that make the conceiving and implementing of law possible, I think the law would be susceptible, as it very often is and increasingly is, to corruption, failure of implementation, and so on. So this connecting of the foreground of law and regulation to the background of the practices that have made it possible and from which it is being disjointed by the crises you're talking about, is something I think only the humanities can really do, because it connects explicit discursive aspects of the law in the foreground to a whole range of customs and habits and practices of tradition, which it's the business of history, of literature, of philosophy, and so on to uncover.
Right. So I want to take that and ask both of you, in fact, what you think on, informing policy and what can be done from the point of view of scholars in humanities to to inform the policymakers, or get them more interested in the insights that you get from your studies in humanities, to inform them so that they form better policies, more human policies, as you mentioned? What do you think needs to be done in face of such crisis, or even in normal times?
Well, I think this is a global kind of issue right now. Universities all around the world are facing a crisis in the humanities, where they have to persuade not only sort of administrators and policymakers and funders, but also students, who are wondering what kind of courses to take and so on, that studying history, literature, ethics, philosophy is something that is important and valuable to their lives. We have a very instrumentalist view of education, particularly in India, I think, where we are kind of put on tracks very early on, and we develop certain kinds of skills very well, but narrowly, and increasingly to the complete kind of exclusion of other kinds. And there's the arts, science, commerce track traditionally, but even more so, as students prepare from earlier and earlier on for competitive exams and so on. So I think definitely, this is a policy issue, in that we need more investment from people who have the resources, to invest in quality liberal arts and humanities education, just to even have the options for students. But it's not even just a kind of policy issue. It's really a wider, I think, societal and civilizational kind of issue for us now to think about what the value of these disciplines and this kind of study is. I mean, I've already outlined what I think its importance is on an everyday kind of basis, or even in combating crises. But I think, rather than just looking at what kind of job will this get me, or what kind of degree will this allow me to have. Of course, those are important issues. I don't want to minimize the importance of that, particularly in these kind of economic times. But those will come and go. Our ability to think critically about ourselves is something, if we lose, we might not be able to put back together or regain so easily. So I think it's very, very important for all of us to have sort of educational options, courses, and conversations where we are thinking critically about literature, about history, and so on, and not just kind of using them as tools for politics, or as tools for employment.
Right. Professor Bilgrami, would you like to add something to this broader context?
Well, one of the things that it would be interesting to try and diagnose is again to go back a little bit in history, go back, say, to the period just after independence in our country. And if you look at the academy and you ask which subjects in the humanities and social sciences really excelled in the academy, I think one has to admit that the only two subjects that really had excellent intellectual productions were history and economics. And I think one ought to diagnose why those two subjects were so creatively pursued in the 20 or 30 years after independence, 30, maybe up as many as 40 years after independence. And I think, one can give very gestural general directions of diagnosis. It's a newly emerging state and newly emerging population of citizenry, and they want to understand their past, and they want to shape a political economy that is relatively creatively different from because the conditions are so different than they are in other parts of the more developed world. So these two subjects stood out. I was a young philosopher, and I must say that I thought my subject was being pursued in a very desultory and lackadaisical way. In fact, I thought all my professors were just collecting a salary and not really doing any hard thinking or any hard teaching. And I suspect that was true of a lot of studies in English literature and other humanities disciplines too. But history and economics did very well. And I can't help feeling that as a result of all this globalization, that is no longer true, certainly not true of economics. I think economics has abdicated its the value-oriented aspect of its discipline, or even the historical aspect of its discipline, and if you go to an economics department, you almost find no courses in the history of economic thought, and the value-oriented aspects of economics are completely abandoned by its practitioners. And that's just an aping of mostly American economics departments. And so I think globalization has had a very bad effect on, it has made us careerist, students careerist, and it has made professors sort of buy into a very derivative mimicry of the scholarly habits of Western universities, especially American universities. So I think what is interesting to me is that the role of the humanities can be quite exciting in India today, and perhaps everywhere else, if it sees itself as picking up the slack that has been created by the abdication in the social sciences of these value-oriented and historical aspects of their discipline in favor of just the quantitative and this very disengaged study that economics has become. And so the humanities could have a potentially very exciting role to play to pick up that slack. And I think, in fact, I think that, as I said about Prachi Deshpande's work, it's in a sense doing that. It's on the borderline of the humanities and the social sciences. And, and the remarks I made earlier about looking at the background is very important, because what it shows is that unlike what is happening with this new turn in the social sciences, it shows that there is a whole humanistic background to what is in the foreground. So if in the foreground you want to study natural resources, well, you have to go back and understand the background of the concept of nature. I mean, nature became natural resources. And how did that happen? How did people become populations? How did knowledge become expertise? I mean, these are the sorts of things that are a sort of reduction of the human side of these concepts. And only the humanities can uncover how that happened and recover what is possible to recover.
Right. That's very insightful, Professor Bilgrami. Thank you so much. And with that, we conclude today's conversations with Professor Prachi Deshpande and Professor Akeel Bilgrami. Thank you both for joining me today and providing valuable insight into this year's Infosys Prize in Humanities, and on what can be done from a humanities point of view to combating any crisis. Dear listeners, Thank you for listening to this episode of the Research Matters podcast. For more such science news and podcasts, please log on to www.researchmatters.in.